In the summer of 1993, the worst river flooding in American history hit the upper Midwest. $15 billion in damages. Over 1,000 levees failed. In Calhoun County, Iowa, 3 concrete levees, engineered, reinforced, Army Corps certified, breached within 4 hours. The water behind them moved at a speed that destroyed everything in its path. 40 minutes. That's all it took. But 3 miles away, an earthen dam with no concrete, no steel, and no engineering documentation absorbed the same flood and did not break. It had been built in 1911, by hand, by a Polish immigrant whose only textbook was what his father had taught him about the way water moves through soil. The engineer who had written recommend demolition in his 1990 survey report came back the next morning. He sat down at the base of the dam, and he stayed there for a very long time. There is a principle in hydraulic engineering so old that it predates the discipline itself, a principle that every river in the world demonstrates every spring, and that every farmer who has ever watched a creek rise in a heavy rain has observed firsthand. Water always finds a way through, not over though it does that too, but through the smallest crack in a concrete wall, through the invisible spaces between soil particles, through the microscopic channels left by earthworm tunnels and root decay and the freeze-thaw cycling of a Midwest winter. Water is not impatient and it is not stupid. It is simply persistent, and persistence, applied without interruption across decades and centuries, accomplishes what no amount of force applied briefly can achieve. Bernard Kowalski understood this. He had understood it since he was 12 years old, standing in a wet field in Calhoun County with his father, watching what water did to the earth berm his grandfather had built across the low point of their north pasture. The berm was 40 years old then, built by Stanisław Kowalski in the spring of 1911, the year after a wet October had flooded the lower 20 acres and ruined a stand of winter wheat that represented 3 months of the family's operating income. Stanisław had not hired an engineer. He had not consulted a textbook. He had watched the flood recede, walked the ground it had covered, and then spent 2 weeks building a berm of layered earth, compacted clay from the creek bank, then a layer of coarser sand, then clay again, then sand, alternating in a pattern he had used in Poland on a farm his family had managed since the late 18th century. The berm was not impressive to look at. It was 12 feet across at the base, 4 feet high, and approximately 180 feet long, following the natural low contour of the field. It had no concrete facing, no steel reinforcement, no drainage pipe, no emergency spillway of the kind that modern dam engineers would have required. It was, to any technically trained eye, a crude structure. In the spring of 1947, when the Des Moines River rose to its highest level in recorded history at that time, the water came against Stanisław's berm and did not break it. Bernard was 12 years old that spring, and he watched it happen. He stood at the upstream face of the berm with his father and watched the water press against the earthen wall, and watched the wall darken as it absorbed moisture, and watched the slight seep that appeared at the toe of the downstream face. A thin film of water that oozed from the base of the berm, and ran in a shallow rivulet toward the drainage ditch and understood, with the wordless comprehension of a child watching a physical process rather than reading about it, that something interesting was happening. "It's letting the water through," he said to his father. "A little," his father said. "Enough. Why doesn't it just break?" His father thought for a moment. "Because it gives a little. The water pushes, and the clay moves. Just enough. Absorbs the pressure. The sand behind it drains what gets through. Nothing builds up hard enough to break anything." He paused, watching the berm. "Your grandfather said, 'Water doesn't break what knows how to yield. It only breaks what is more stubborn than water, and nothing is more stubborn than water.'" Bernard remembered that sentence for 60 years. He was 69 years old in the spring of 1993, and he had been farming the same 420 acre operation in Calhoun County his entire life, the same land his grandfather had homesteaded in 1898, the same field Stanisław had protected with layered earthen berms after the flood of 1910, the same north pasture where Bernard had watched the berm hold in 1947. He had expanded and improved the earth structures over the decades, adding 2 additional berms on the west boundary, and extending the main north berm by 60 feet when drainage patterns shifted after he tiled a field in 1974. But the design principle had never changed. Alternating layers of compacted clay and clean sand, no concrete, no steel, built to absorb and filter rather than to resist and deflect. He had been questioned about this design exactly twice in 40 years of farming. The first time was in 1971, when a young soil conservation technician from the USDA had visited the farm to assess eligibility for cost-share assistance on erosion control structures. The technician had looked at the north berm, consulted his manual, and informed Bernard that the structure did not meet USDA specifications for a Class 1 impoundment. Specifically, it lacked the required concrete outlet structure and the designed emergency spillway. Bernard was not eligible for cost share on existing structures, and if he wanted to build new ones, they would need to meet the current design standards. Bernard thanked him and did not apply for cost share. The second time was in the spring of 1990, when Tom Garrett had come to the county as part of the Army Corps of Engineers Regional Levee Improvement Program. Garrett was 44 years old in 1993. A civil engineer from the Corps' Rock Island District office, with a master's degree from Iowa State and 11 years of experience designing flood control infrastructure across the upper Midwest. He was not an arrogant man, but he was a confident one, confident in the way that people who have spent years solving complex problems with quantifiable methods develop confidence, a confidence rooted in the reliable performance of engineered systems under known conditions. He had designed levees in Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota that had held against significant flood events. He believed, with evidence, in reinforced concrete, in designed spillways, in hydraulic calculations that accounted for the specific soil conditions, flood frequency, and structural loading at each site. He had first visited the Kowalski farm in 1990 as part of a regional survey, cataloging non-federal flood control structures in Calhoun County for the Corps database. He had measured Bernard's north berm, photographed it, noted its dimensions and estimated construction date, and written in his survey notes, "Earth fill structure, approx. 1,911, no outlet works, no emergency spillway, no design documentation, does not meet current design standards. Recommend replacement or upgrade before next significant flood event." He had not, at that time, told Bernard what he had written. He had simply thanked him for his time, photographed the berm from 3 angles, and driven away. Bernard had watched him drive away and then gone back to the equipment shed to finish servicing the planter. The spring of 1993 announced itself in Iowa with the particular atmospheric combination that hydrologists and meteorologists had, in retrospect, identified as the necessary precondition for the catastrophe that followed. A wet winter that had saturated the soil profile to near capacity, followed by a spring that refused to dry. May of 1993 was the wettest May in Iowa since records began in 1873. June was wetter still. The soil, already at field capacity from the winter saturation, had nowhere to put the June rainfall except into the streams and rivers that drained the agricultural landscape of central Iowa. The Des Moines River and its tributaries, the Raccoon River, the South Skunk, the Iowa River. By the first week of July, the Des Moines River at Raccoon River confluence was approaching the National Weather Service flood stage of 23 feet. On July 9th, a single rainfall event dropped 8 inches of rain in 24 hours across the upper Des Moines watershed, a precipitation total that the local gauge network had never previously recorded for that duration. The river responded as saturated watersheds respond to extreme rainfall. It rose with a speed and magnitude that exceeded every flood frequency model in the Corps' existing projections for that location. The Great Flood of 1993 ultimately broke more than 1,000 federal and non-federal levees along the Mississippi and Missouri river systems and their tributaries. 50 people died. Damages approached $15 billion. In Iowa alone, hundreds of thousands of acres of cropland were inundated. Des Moines lost its municipal water supply for 11 days when the Raccoon River overtopped the levee, protecting the water treatment plant. Barge traffic on the Mississippi was suspended for nearly 2 months. In Calhoun County, the Des Moines River, running through the eastern portion of the county on its way south, rose to a level that the county's flood records described only as unprecedented. The river crested at 12.4 feet above flood stage on July 11th. The modern concrete and steel-reinforced levees that the Army Corps had built along the lower reaches of the county's agricultural drainage corridors were designed for a 100-year flood event, a flow level with a 1% annual probability of occurrence, based on the historical flood frequency record. The July 1993 event was estimated, in post-flood analysis, to be a 500-year event on several gauge stations in the upper Des Moines watershed. The levees had been designed for 100 years. The flood delivered 500. The mathematics were straightforward, and the outcome was catastrophic. 3 of the 4 concrete-reinforced levees in the lower county were breached on the morning of July 11th, within 4 hours of each other. The breaches were not gradual. They were catastrophic failures. The engineering term is sudden breach, in which the structure, resisting the hydraulic load up to a threshold, fails completely and instantaneously when that threshold is exceeded. A concrete levee under catastrophic overtopping does not seep and yield and partially hold. It fails. And when it fails, the water behind it moves through the breach with a velocity and volume that destroys everything downstream. The farms behind those 3 levees lost their crops, their topsoil, and in 2 cases their outbuildings, in the space of approximately 40 minutes. Bernard's North Berm, built by his grandfather in 1911, absorbed the same flood event. Tom Garrett was on the ground in Calhoun County within 18 hours of the levee failures. He had been at the Rock Island District Office when the emergency calls started coming in, and he had driven through the night with 2 engineers from his team, arriving in the county at 4 a.m. on July 12th to begin damage assessment. He documented the 3 concrete levee failures methodically. Photographs, measurements of breach width and depth, estimates of discharge velocity from the scour patterns in the soil downstream, interviews with the farmers who had been watching from a distance when the failures occurred. Each failure had the same signature overtopping, leading to erosion of the downstream face of the levee, followed by rapid undercutting of the concrete structure and sudden complete breach. The concrete had held until it couldn't, and then it had not held at all. At 9 a.m. on July 12th, he drove to the Kowalski farm. He found Bernard standing at the downstream toe of the North Berm, looking at the ground. The berm had been submerged to within 8 inches of its crest at the peak of the flood. The upstream face was saturated and soft. The clay surface darkened and slightly slumped where the water had pressed against it. The downstream face showed a wide band of moisture seep, the telltale sign of water that had moved through the berm's filter layers rather than over or under it. At the toe of the downstream face, the seep zone extended approximately 6 feet outward, the soil damp but intact. No erosion, no piping, no breach. The 180 acres of cropland behind the berm were wet. The seep water had raised the water table in the immediate downstream area, but they were intact. No floodwater had come over the berm. No breach had occurred. The corn was stressed from the high water table but standing. It held, Garrett said. It was not quite a question. It held, Bernard said. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say anything beyond those 2 words for several minutes. Garrett walked the length of the berm, examining the downstream face, noting the seep pattern, taking photographs. He knelt at the toe and pressed the saturated soil with his hand, feeling the moisture level, estimating the permeability. He stood and looked at the structure for a long time. "The seep zone is 6 feet wide," he said. "That means water was moving through this structure at a significant rate during peak flood. Under normal dam safety standards, that level of seepage would be considered a warning sign, a potential precursor to piping failure." "I know," Bernard said, "but it didn't pipe." "No." Garrett looked at the berm again. "The sand layers," he said. "Yes, they're acting as filter zones. The clay holds back the fine particles that would otherwise move with the seep water and initiate piping. The sand drains the pressure. The clay and sand together," he stopped, "are doing what my grandfather said," Bernard said, "yielding without failing." Garrett sat down on the downstream slope of the berm, in the wet grass, and looked at the intact cornfield behind it. "I wrote in my survey notes in 1990 that this structure should be replaced," he said. "I know. A friend at the county extension office told me. I was wrong." Bernard said nothing. "Not about the standards," Garrett said. "The structure genuinely doesn't meet current design standards. But the standards were designed to describe what makes a structure safe under known conditions. This structure is operating under different principles. It's using permeability as a safety mechanism rather than as a failure mode. The textbook says seepage is a problem to be prevented. This dam uses seepage as pressure relief." He looked at the seep zone again. "It's counterintuitive. You wouldn't design it this way on purpose with current methods." "My grandfather designed it this way on purpose," Bernard said. "With 60 years of watching what water does to Polish farmland." That was his textbook. The technical principle that Garrett had observed and struggled to articulate in the field that morning had a name in geotechnical engineering, though it had not yet been widely applied to agricultural flood control structures in the upper Midwest. It was called zoned earthfill design, and its formal development in American dam engineering dated to the Bureau of Reclamation's large-scale dam construction programs of the 1930s and 1940s, when engineers working on structures like Hoover Dam's downstream appurtenant works had discovered, through empirical observation and subsequent analysis, that stratified embankments with distinct zones of different permeability performed dramatically better under seepage conditions than homogeneous earthfill. The key insight was the concept of the filter zone, a layer of clean, well-graded sand placed between an impermeable clay core and a more permeable outer shell, sized so that the sand's particles were small enough to prevent the clay's particles from migrating through it. A phenomenon called piping, but large enough to allow water to drain freely, relieving the hydraulic pressure that would otherwise build to failure levels. A concrete structure under hydraulic pressure has no filter zone. It is impermeable, or nearly so, and it resists water entirely rather than managing it. This resistance is its strength in conditions below the design threshold, and its fatal weakness above it. When the hydraulic pressure exceeds the structure's resistance, failure is sudden, total, and irreversible. Stanisław Kowalski's alternating clay and sand berm was, in engineering terms, a primitive but functionally correct zoned earthfill structure. The clay layers provided the impermeable core, the sand layers provided the filter zones. The alternating pattern, built by hand from materials available at the creek bank, had achieved through observation and accumulated experience rather than calculation, the same functional principle that Bureau of Reclamation engineers had formalized 3 decades later. Bernard had known this intuitively for 60 years. He had not known the name for it, and he had not needed to. Garrett returned to Bernard's farm 3 more times in the following 6 months. He brought 2 geotechnical engineers on the second visit, who extracted soil samples from the berm's cross-section carefully at 3 locations, leaving the structure intact, and analyzed the particle size distribution of each layer in a laboratory. The results confirmed what the field observation had suggested. The clay layers had a hydraulic conductivity of approximately 1 × 10 to the power of -7 centimeters per second, effectively impermeable, while the sand layers had a hydraulic conductivity 4 to 5 orders of magnitude higher, providing exactly the drainage gradient needed to prevent piping. The clay-to-sand layer ratio in Stanisław's berm was approximately 60 to 40 by volume, within 5 percentage points of the ratio specified in the Bureau of Reclamation's engineering manual for zoned earth-fill structures in similar soil conditions. Stanisław had determined that ratio by feel and experience, building berms on Polish farmland where the same layered design had been used, according to family memory, since at least the mid-19th century. He had carried the knowledge across the Atlantic in 1898 and applied it to Iowa clay and Iowa sand because the physics of water pressure and soil filtration were the same in Iowa as they were in Poland. The physics did not carry a passport, neither did the knowledge of how to work with them. The formal integration of zoned earth-fill design principles into the Army Corps of Engineers' levee construction and rehabilitation guidelines for agricultural districts in the upper Midwest was not rapid. Institutional processes in large federal agencies move at their own pace, governed by budget cycles and regulatory requirements, and the inherent conservatism of organizations responsible for public safety infrastructure. But the process did begin, in part, with the documentation that Garrett's team produced from the Kowalski Farm Assessment. The Corps' internal technical report, completed in March 1994, was titled Performance of Earth-Fill Flood Control Structures in the Upper Des Moines Watershed during the 1993 flood event. It documented 5 surviving earth-fill structures that had held during the flood, contrasted with 11 concrete and reinforced masonry structures that had breached. The Kowalski North Berm was the most thoroughly documented of the 5 surviving structures, and its performance data seepage rates, downstream saturation extent, particle size analysis, construction history occupied 22 pages of the report's appendix. Garrett wrote the Kowalski section himself. In the technical summary, he described the berm as a field-constructed zoned earth-fill embankment, whose design, derived from traditional agricultural practice in Central Europe rather than formal engineering specifications, achieved functional hydraulic performance equivalent to designed filter zone earth-fill structures, as specified in EM 111022300. In the report's recommendation section, he wrote, "The performance of traditional earth-fill structures under the 1993 flood event warrants systematic study of pre-engineering agricultural impoundment design principles with the goal of identifying empirically derived design parameters that may improve the performance and cost-effectiveness of rural agricultural flood control infrastructure." The Kowalski North Berm provides a case study of particular value, as its construction history is documented across 3 generations, and its performance data across 2 major flood events, 1947, 1993, provides a longitudinal record unavailable for formally engineered structures of comparable age. The report was circulated within the Corps, and eventually reached the desk of a professor of geotechnical engineering at Iowa State University named Dr. Helen McGuire, who had been studying embankment dam performance data from the 1993 flood as part of a post-flood research initiative funded by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. She called Garrett. He drove her to the Kowalski farm in the spring of 1994. Bernard made coffee and answered her questions for 3 hours. Dr. McGuire's research paper, published in the Journal of Geotechnical Engineering in 1996, was titled Functional Analysis of Traditionally Constructed Zoned Earth-Fill Agricultural Embankments, a case study from the 1993 Upper Midwest flood. It documented the Kowalski berm's design parameters, laboratory soil analysis results, and flood performance data, and compared them against the Bureau of Reclamation's design specifications for equivalent engineered structures. Its principal finding, stated in the abstract, was, The subject structure, constructed without engineering specifications or professional design oversight, achieved hydraulic performance indistinguishable from designed zoned earthfill structures conforming to Bureau of Reclamation Engineering Manual EM 155. Filter zone particle size ratios, clay core permeability, and piping resistance characteristics are within the acceptable performance range for designed structures of equivalent cross-section dimensions. This performance appears attributable to construction methods derived from traditional Central European agricultural practice, in which the functional principle of differential permeability zones was empirically developed and transmitted across multiple generations of practitioners. The paper received enough attention within the geotechnical community that Dr. Maguire was invited to present it at the 1997 Annual Conference of the United States Society on Dams. Garrett attended the presentation. He sat in the back row and listened to Dr. Maguire describe, in the technical language of his profession, the principle that an 80-year-old Polish immigrant had applied with a shovel and a wheelbarrow on an Iowa creek bank in 1911. After the presentation, he found Maguire in the hallway. "There's something I want to make sure the paper captures correctly," he said. "The construction method, the alternating layers." Kowalski's grandfather didn't arrive at that design by accident or by imitation of an engineering manual. He brought it from Poland. It was already old when he got here. "I know," Maguire said. "That's in the paper, transmitted traditional practice." "I want people to understand what that means," Garrett said. "It means someone in Poland decades before the Bureau of Reclamation existed, decades before zoned earthfill design was formalized, understood that the filter principle worked, and they taught their children. And their children taught their children. And the child of those children built a berm in Iowa that held a 500-year flood." Maguire looked at him for a moment. "Is there a point you want me to add to the paper?" Garrett thought about it. "Yes," he said. "The point is that the knowledge of how to work with water, how to yield to it rather than fight it, existed before the engineering formulas that describe why it works. The formulas caught up to the knowledge, not the other way around." Maguire added a paragraph to the paper's conclusion section before the final publication. It read, "The performance of the Kowalski embankment suggests that empirically derived design knowledge, transmitted through non-institutional channels across multiple generations of agricultural practitioners, may represent a repository of hydraulic engineering insight whose value extends beyond the specific structures it produced. The challenge for the engineering profession is not to replace such knowledge and integrate it before the practitioners who carry it are no longer available to be asked." The Army Corps of Engineers incorporated zoned earthfill design guidelines specifically for rural agricultural impoundment structures into the revised edition of their Levee Design Technical Manual in 2001. The revision included a section on filter zone design for low-head earthfill structures, the category that covered farm berms and agricultural drainage impoundments that drew substantially on the research documented. In Maguire's 1996 paper, and in the Corps' own 1994 post-flood technical report, Bernard Kowalski was not invited to the revision committee. He was 77 years old by then, and he was still farming, though his son Patrick had taken over the primary field operations. He did not read technical manuals. He read the weather forecast every morning and the soil moisture reports from the Iowa Environmental Mesonet every evening, and he walked his berms every spring before the flood season began, checking the downstream face for any unusual seepage patterns, trimming the vegetation that colonized the slope, tamping any settlement in the crest. When Patrick told him about the Corps manual revision and what Dr. Maguire's paper had said, he listened without particular expression and then went back to what he had been doing, which was sharpening a post-hole digger. "Is that all?" Patrick asked. "Your great-grandfather knew it worked," Bernard said. "I knew it worked. Now they know it works. Good. Now they can build more of them." He resumed sharpening. By 2024, Bernard's North Berm had survived 6 significant flood events since 1993. The floods of 1999, 2004, 2008, 2011, 2019, and 2023. In each event, the downstream face had shown the characteristic seep pattern that indicated water was moving through the filter zones under pressure, and in each event, the berm had held. The seep zone widened slightly with each event and then contracted as the flood receded and the soil drainage resumed. The clay core remained intact. No piping had occurred in 113 years of operation. The concrete levees that had failed in 1993 had been rebuilt, some to original design, some with zoned earthfill elements incorporated into the new construction, and had subsequently been tested by the 2008 flood, which the Iowa Environmental Mesonet recorded as the worst local flood event in the county since 1993. 2 of the rebuilt levees had held. One had failed again, at a different location from the 1993 breach. Bernard died in the winter of 2016, 2 months after his 92nd birthday, in the farmhouse where he had been born. He had farmed the same ground for 73 years. He had watched the same North Berm hold through 2 generations of flood events and outlast 2 generations of concrete structures built by engineers who had, eventually, arrived at the same design principle his grandfather had brought from Poland a century before. Patrick maintained the berm the same way his father had: spring inspection, vegetation management, crest tamping. He kept a log of each flood event in a notebook: flood date, estimated peak water level against the upstream face, seep zone width at peak, condition of crest and downstream face after flood recession. The notebook was on its 4th volume. In 2022, Dr. McGuire's former graduate student, now an assistant professor of geotechnical engineering at Iowa State, had contacted Patrick to ask whether the farm would be willing to participate in a long-term monitoring study, installing pore pressure sensors and soil moisture probes in the berm's cross-section to create a real-time dataset of the structure's hydraulic behavior during flood events. Patrick had agreed. He had one condition: the sensors had to be installed in a way that did not disturb the layer structure of the berm's interior. "Of course," the professor said, "we're not changing anything. We're just trying to understand what's already working." "Good," Patrick said, "because what's already working has been working for 110 years. I'd hate to interfere with it." The monitoring sensors went in the fall of 2022. In the spring flood of 2023, they recorded for the first time with instrumented precision the internal hydraulic dynamics of Stanisław Kowalski's berm under flood loading: the progressive saturation of the clay core from the upstream face, the pressure gradient across the clay-sand interface, the drainage rate in the sand filter zones, and the gradual, controlled dissipation of hydraulic pressure that had, across 6 major floods and 112 years, prevented every catastrophic failure that the same load would have inflicted on a concrete structure of equivalent dimensions. The data were, as the monitoring professor wrote in the paper, submitted to the Journal of Geotechnical and Geoenvironmental Engineering in 2024, consistent with optimal zoned earthfill hydraulic performance as specified in current Bureau of Reclamation and Army Corps of Engineers design standards, with filter zone drainage efficiency metrics in the 92nd percentile of designed structures in the monitoring database. The 92nd percentile of designed structures, built by hand in 1911 by a man who had learned the method from his father in Poland and carried it to Iowa in a head full of knowledge that no textbook had yet written down. Patrick read the paper at the kitchen table. He put it down, looked out the window at the North Berm, visible across the wet spring field. 92nd percentile, he said to nobody in particular. Then he went to check the morning seep readings, the same way his father had, and his father's father had, and Stanisław had, on every spring morning when the creek was running high and the water was pressing against the earth and the earth was, as it had always been, learning to yield.